Should be going live on YouTube. And recording.
Just double check that YouTube's showing that. Yeah, that's showing that we're live now.
Okay.
It's just showing, obviously it's just showing myself, which is fine. So, welcome everybody who is watching this podcast today. You've got myself, one of the hosts, Ryan Yates, and John is lovely in helping us in recording it for us because I've had some tech difficulties getting this sorted. And we've got with us Tobias Weltner. So I'll let Tobias introduce himself.
Hello, thank you for having me. Yeah, well, what do you want me to say? Well, I'm sort of running the PowerShell conference EU, and I have created the ISE steroids editor and worked with lots of tooling stuff in the PowerShell area. And maybe I can say I'm fortunate enough to can work full-time on PowerShell. Most people have to do really hard things. I can just play around and help people deal with PowerShell.
So you get the best of all the worlds, really.
That is true.
So just to give everybody a bit of background, obviously you and I have known each other for a number of years now.
Right.
Since at least when I got into the PowerShell community at the end of 2013. But you've been with the PowerShell community for many years before that. I mean, seen it from the early days.
If you ever would be asked to take one profession with you on a lonely island, you should probably take IT people, because IT people tend to have backgrounds from all kinds of areas. And so I started in the medical field, so I'm a medical doctor actually, but I did IT before, and then my parents forced me to learn something serious, which was medical stuff, and then I returned to IT, and basically. Really, I started with VB script automation in the 90s. I just told my wife that I'm so old now. It's crazy. Anyway, and then I was fortunate enough to meet Jeffrey, and he showed us very early his work on Monad. Back then it was called Monad. And at that time I really thought, oh, that's awesome, and that sucks too, because I was at that time so proficient in VB script that I loved it. And then they decided to come up with something new. That sucked. But only for a very short time, because then very, very quickly I fell in love with PowerShell. And ever since, well, I wrote a couple books, and I'm sort of digesting the information and trying to, I'm not saying regurgitate, but I'm trying to help people digest it easily.
So PowerShell's really evolved over the years, and like one of the things that for me as a host that I kind of want to get for these sort of conversations that we have when we have people like yourself on is to get your understanding of what the history of PowerShell as a language, how it's evolved over the years. What was it like really in the beginning days? I mean, even pre V1 being released, and how has it evolved over the last decade and almost a half.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you think about what's the purpose of a script language, it really is only to orchestrate individual commands. And so if you take a batch file or a VB script or a corn shell, whatever it is, it's simply like taking individual commands and then create your own workflow out of it. And very quickly, in fact, even in PowerShell version 1, it was visible that there was couple of new things in PowerShell. For example, the shell wasn't limited to executables. You could access the full .NET framework. You could access COM components just like VB script could. And so it was a very rich, Lego construction set that you could expand if something was missing. And that was already implemented in version 1, as was the object-oriented pipeline. That's all basic architecture that was available in 2006. Of course, a lot of commanders were still missing, but back in these days, it was really like a pioneering age, and people were proud to find out API calls or work on commands by themselves. And then over the years, I think with PowerShell 2, we added, or we've seen remoting being added, and attributes and advanced functions and stuff like that. So it became really mature. And I guess in PowerShell 3, 2009? Was it 2009? Yes.
Yep.
No, 2012, right? Anyway, it was PowerShell 3. The language was really complete at that time, and there has not much been added ever since to the language itself. And so I still think PowerShell is a visionary, awesome, very powerful and extensible shell, and I love it. I really love it. In the last couple of years, obviously, a lot of work was invested into open sourcing PowerShell and making it cross-platform, and that is very important too.
So going back to V2 timescales, because I actually got involved with PowerShell a little bit later after V2 coming around, but V2 was my sort of first forte into using PowerShell, which is when we got the first version of the ISE. But prior to that, you didn't have the ISE. You didn't have an integrated scripting environment. You just had other tool sets. One of the ones I know that was quite well known at that time was PowerGUI. But what was the other tooling like at that time?
Well, at that time, I was actually working on PowerShell Plus. PowerShell Plus was basically the commercial competitor to PowerGUI. And while PowerGUI was sponsored by I think it was Quest. Yeah, I think Quest, exactly. And then when they were bought by Dell, the whole thing stopped. But a couple of years it was sponsored by Quest. We didn't have any sponsors, so that was the reason why we had to charge license fees. But PowerShell Plus was quite popular at that time too. It was a real console embedded in a Windows application, and actually, let me think. Yeah, Idera eventually took over that tool, and I think it was still available for a long time.
It was a very different time having those sort of tools compared to the tooling that we have now. I mean, just today I had to go and work on a Server 2008 R2 box with PowerShell V2, and the old ISE brings back memories with it. It's, with its triple pane, where you've got the script pane, then you've got the output pane, and then you've got the sort of terminal built into it. It's very different between.
Wasn't that an ugly UI?
Ugly is one way of putting it. It was a workable UI.
Yeah,
just about.
Well, the ISE in PowerShell 3 was so much more mature than, don't you think?
Yes, I think V3 for me was, and actually, in all honesty, I actually skipped V3 and I went on to V4 because the time that came around, it was all around about the same sort of time that I'd just moved off from some servers being on 2008 and started working with 2012. Right. And obviously DSC as well had started coming out at that point. And for me, I kind of skipped 3. But a lot of the functionality that, as you said before, that we use today came in V3 that was incredible. Like the updatable help system, for example, came in V3.
That's true. And also the auto import for modules, that was very important, that you no longer had to know where the modules are and what their names are, but instead PowerShell was caching the commands and was even suggesting the commands via IntelliSense and on-demand load the module.
That's both a great piece of functionality, but also it can be a bit of a curse as well. Because obviously with new modules coming onto your system and having the command cache, you've then got a potential for commands overriding each other by module authors using the same one. An example that I'll use that was quite recent was the Microsoft Graph module that wanted to use a get user command, and we're like, no, this needs to have a prefix of some sort.
Exactly.
Just
exactly that. But don't you think that that was awesome in the beginning, that we had a really strict conventions, that we had really very well and carefully designed command names, and then over the time with more and more modules in the field and obviously more pressure and time constraints, we do see these kind of conflicts because there's not a prefix, like you say.
I think one of the key things, looking back, we're in February in 2020, and looking back at PowerShell and how it was designed for V1, V2, V3, and so on and so forth, it was always designed in such a good way that it, even the things that we're coming up against now, with command clashing and things like that, was already thought about back at that point. Mm-hmm. Obviously, it kind of took off a little bit in V2, where you got the module system, because obviously prior to V2 it was PowerShell snap-ins, so you had to be a C# developer to really be building commandlets for people to use, or you were dot sourcing scripts to be able to make use of functions within them.
Can I ask you, have you seen snap-ins around lately any longer, or are they finally gone for good?
I would like to say they're finally gone, but a shout out to the SharePoint product team, who still haven't got rid of their SharePoint snap-in as of yet. I hopefully will have some conversations at MVP Summit in a few weeks with the product team, see if we can finally get that one kind of moved over. Because
I was thinking that Jeff Snover 2 years ago at the PowerShell conference officially announced that snap-ins are obsolete. So we have an official.
And in V7 you can't even import them.
Exactly. So they should move.
Yeah. So yeah, it's interesting to see how things have evolved over the years. I mean, I know I came into the PowerShell world at the tail end of 2013, as I said before, and I've seen such an amazing growth in not just the quantity of things that are being published, but also the quality of them. And I think a lot of that comes down to the history of the growth of the community. And this brings on to a good next point, because obviously we've both seen the community grow over the years, and I know from my perspective, running and helping run here in the UK the PowerShell user groups, and Daniel Krebs, credit to him, he's just joined us as an MVP this January, has done an amazing job with the UK user groups. We've grown again. We've got another couple of groups going, and I know there's more and more groups popping up every couple of months.
Yeah, it's amazing. And then I attended a couple of events lately, and obviously asked attendees what made them come and how they found their way to PowerShell. And it is an increasing number of people who were saying, we're coming from the Linux world and we are really curious to see what PowerShell can do. And so there is, in fact, due to the PowerShell 7 cross-platform capabilities, a huge new number of people coming from different places. Which,
the stats that Steve Lee and the team have got via their Power BI public dashboard do show that. I'm always cautious with those stats, because the stats don't show anything to do with Windows PowerShell 5.1, unfortunately. So I think unfortunately the BI dashboard is a little skewed in the favor of the open source and Linux side. It would be great if we could get some sort of telemetry from Windows World. Obviously, I don't expect that we would get full telemetry, but for the people who are like myself, who are more than willing to say, yeah, I'm actually holding my hand up and I'm still using 5.1 on these particular servers, that's fine. Because it gives, unfortunately, I think it gives the PowerShell team a little bit of false sense that they're now moving to a point where there's nobody using 5.1.
No,
we know that's very not true, because
like last year when we had the opening at the PowerShell conference EU, we did a questionnaire before we started the conference, and the overwhelming number of people are using Windows PowerShell 5.1 at this point, simply because of a number of reasons. But this may change more and more now that PowerShell 7 really is sort of homing in onto compatibility issues. I was really pleased to see that finally the module Active Directory runs natively, doesn't use those workarounds anymore. But for Windows people, up until just very recently, what would be a good reason to move to PowerShell 7? There isn't one. It is coming now that the compatibility is there, that the increased performance matters, and that the bug fixes matter, and that it's nice to be able to install it side by side as a portable app. But most people just take what's in the box.
Yeah, that's a common way of working with, especially in enterprises. You know, the little amount of stuff that you have to add on to a box keeps security a bit happier. It also makes it easier to continue to do things. I mean, for example, your PowerShell ISE steroids is a fantastic module because of the fact that it's a fantastic addition to the ISE because it's a module that's an addition to the ISE, exactly, as opposed to it being another install. I quite regularly actually still have to go back to using the ISE for a couple of things. Though I do use Visual Studio Code quite a lot now, but there are areas where I find that the support is still better in ISE than it is in Visual Studio Code, particularly around writing DSC configurations. I found that might just be me.
I think we have to sort of acknowledge that Visual Studio Code is a primary editor and is very, very strong, has very, very strong editor features and support for so many languages, but it is no host. And we always have to remember that only the editor services allow it to be a development environment. And only recently they finally got to a level where I think now it is on equal height when it comes to the host functionality. But it is like today, you can use either editor. However, obviously, since I developed ISE steroids, I'm working a lot with ISE still, and ISE is not as slick, but it is still a very, very strong development environment, provided you don't have to work in a team, and provided you don't need to work in the cloud or work across many languages, different languages.
Yeah, I think ISE still works quite well though. If you do need to work in those team environments. Granted, there's some features within Visual Studio Code like the fantastic, and I don't know if you've used this, live share functionality within Visual Studio Code, where you can actually share your editor pane and your terminal with somebody else. So you can do proper pair programming side by side or remotely with somebody. That's been for me one of the greatest additional bits of functionality within Visual Studio Code, because I can sit with somebody who may be quite a proficient C# developer but isn't a proficient PowerShell developer, and we can go through their code and my code quite nicely and easily together.
Of course. But that is not a specific PowerShell thing, right? It's built into Visual Studio Code, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's what I meant, that Visual Studio Code is a very strong editor with very strong feature sets across all the languages that it supports. And that is coincidentally a reason why there is not much specific PowerShell editors and IDE and developments anymore, because there's just no way you can work and keep up with this rich feature set that comes with Visual Studio Code. And at the same time, I'm still hoping that at some point we'll see a good documentation of editor services and some stability. Obviously, there's lots of changes when you are trying to find the best way. But for third party, it's really important to have some dependable and long-term dependable documentation architecture.
Yeah, I think one of the things that would be great for the ecosystem around Visual Studio Code and editor services is to kind of do like a long-term servicing branch. You know, this is a long version that we expect is going to only get bug fixes, but we expect is incredibly stable, because that would bring a lot of confidence. I think especially for enterprises adopting it, but also it brings a bit more confidence for us long-term users who are using it daily but still seeing daily issues with the editor. but it like everything else, it's a work in progress.
Exactly.
And, the amount of work that has gone into that over the the last 4 or 5 years has been tremendous.
Yes.
Still remember seeing some of the original presentations about this is what it's going to look like using Visual Studio Code for developing PowerShell. Going back 4 years ago now. Doesn't seem that long, but it's
yeah. I mean, the major breakthrough was really when the interactive window finally started to work. I mean, just imagine in the very first versions there was no interactive PowerShell window that really worked.
Do you think the community's kind of grown a lot since PowerShell went open source? Do you think that?
I believe there is. Yes, it does grow because there's just a huge new audience that wasn't targeted before, like all the people who are working on Linux. And I don't think that it has any impact on the number of Windows users.
Do you think the amount of people that are in and active within the community, whether that's commenting on issues within the PowerShell repository, adding pull requests, commenting on the RFCs that the team have been raising, and including actually raising RFCs as well. And then the wider side of the community, where it comes to the user groups, the conferences, the community leaders, that sort of things. Do you think that has grown hugely?
Yes,
Has it been growing at the same pace it was, say, 2 years ago, 3 years ago? What do you think?
Well, I think it just takes some time for people to adjust and to get familiar with all these things. I mean, there's so many people out there who have never really touched Git or GitHub or maintained their projects with Git. And so the more people are actually starting to use these things, the more rapidly will the whole thing grow. So it's like how do you say this when it's not linear, but it's logarithmic. So at some point we'll see an ever increasing growth here.
And do you think, obviously, I'm speaking now from a community leader sort of mindset, but do you think that that's something that we as community leaders probably need to start giving that more opportunity for the entry level people who are coming into this as a new language, but are seeing all the other things that you need to do alongside learning PowerShell to be really successful, like as you mentioned, learning Git and using GitHub.
Right. I mean, you're very familiar with this because you're running a user group, and I'm not running a user group in Hanover, but I am very close to a Hanover user group, and I think the user group setting is the perfect place to sort of invite people to come along and learn these things firsthand. And I'm not sure about you guys. Do you have virtual meetings or just physical meetings?
We tend to do physical meetings. The reason behind that was it was made for the decision to do physical meetings over virtual meetings to begin with was really as a desire to really grow a community that wanted to continue growing. Because virtual meetings, I find they're very easy for people to say, yes, I'd like to attend that, but something has just cropped up and I know it'll be recorded, so I'll just watch it afterwards. Whereas a physical meeting is very much, I might not actually see this afterwards, and I might actually get to meet people and have share a conversation with somebody who may be able to help me with a little issue that I might be having. I know that the London user group, I've had quite a few different conversations with people there around some of their code that they've got that isn't working, and we've managed to get it working by the end of the user group. Whilst somebody's presenting as well. So there's multiple levels of things that can happen at a user group. I know one of the things I'm thinking of for this year ahead, for the rest of 2020, is what do we do with putting on maybe smaller events in the UK where it might be just a hands-on training hackathon sort of thing around learning Git and around building a very simple PowerShell module. The start of giving people the opportunity and the ideas of where they can then take the skills learned into real world scenarios, because I don't think we've really built that sort of training materials up in a way as a community. I know the likes of some of the other guys that do a lot of the work in the US, like Jeff Hicks, Adam Bertram, and others. They do a lot of that, but I don't think we see a lot of in-person experience of that, if that makes sense. And I think that's something that, to really grow the PowerShell community as a wider community, I think we need to come together and build some training materials that we as a community open source for use within the community, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. And I just wanted to say in Hanover, it is like it is with you guys, we focus more on physical attendance, but also experimented a little bit with virtual meetings, like putting up a camera and letting people share and join the meetings. Because it's always hard for people who are not living in a big city to find a competent or like a busy user group. And for them, it's nice to just be able to just listen to the presentations. Regarding training materials, that's an interesting thought. How would you think that would make sense? Like a wiki or like a book productions?
It would more likely to need to be a task-based idea. You know, we have a set period of time of, say, 2 to 3 hours, and at the end of this period of time, you will have X, and you will have learned Y. So an example for that is you might have a local client HyperV lab, and you will have learned how to configure that lab and deploy onto that lab a AD domain controller using DSC. And I know there was the training day at one of the PSConf VUs a couple of years ago with Automated Lab, which is essentially doing that. So, as I say, I think there's ways to go forward, and I think there's conversations many of the user group leaders and MVPs can have on this to see, is there something that we can pull together? I understand there's a lot of effort that goes into these sort of things, having looked at doing 3 of them myself. So it's not a we'll do it. It's a kind of makes sense to try and think about doing it, I think. Right.
Yeah.
And I think actually that puts us onto a really good standing for the next point. I know it's around about the history of the PowerShell conferences. So I know you and I have a shared history when it comes to PSConf EU, but you also have a very, very interesting history with Germany and the PowerShell conferences prior to that.
That is true. Well, basically, I can just tell a little bit about that time. That was when there was no conference, no PowerShell conference at all, and PowerShell was just fresh. And then that was basically the time when the US Summit started. At the same time, with the US Summit, we started a German PowerShell conference. And the objective was really we thought in Germany, in Austria, in Switzerland, when you take all these people, the number of people together, that is basically comparable to the US. And so why not talk in native tongue? Because it's much easier, and you can better express your questions, and maybe you feel more comfortable. However, we quickly found that it is really hard to find good PowerShell speakers in Germany only, or with German language proficiency. And another point was Bruce Payette was really a very loyal supporter, and he was with us from the very early German PowerShell conferences. However, it sucked that he couldn't understand a thing. Obviously, when people talked, they talked in German. And so when at some point, I don't even know the year, but when the US Summit decided to no longer have their European branch conference any longer, we decided to just combine this, the German conference and this English conference, and started with mixed tracks. So we first had a German track and an English track, and experimented over the years with many things. We had once 5 parallel tracks too. So we tried all kinds of stuff. And in the end, it turned out that 3 tracks is really the best trade-off between having a choice and not missing too much. and we pretty much switched over to English-only sessions, which is not really the best solution. It is probably the least bad solution, but it is hard for people who are like in Scandinavia. I think it is impressive how well people speak and understand English, primarily probably because they don't have so many synchronized TV shows. But for German people who are used to watching synchronized German movies, it is sometimes very straining to listen for 4 days, listen to English sessions.
Yeah, that's something I can totally understand. I think as time goes on, we'll probably see a need for more regional conferences. So, like obviously in the UK, we've started PS Day, the PS Day event. I think in time, there's definitely going to be a need for another German-only PowerShell conference. I don't see why that couldn't be anytime soon, but that would obviously be dependent on timescales within, in Germany and what's going on, whether people actually have the time to be able to put together something like that. But it should be, in my opinion, that should be a German-only conference. It shouldn't be an English-led conference.
Like I said, it is hard really to get together authoritative speakers in the PowerShell team and Jeffrey for too many different conferences. And so I would estimate that there will only be per continent one huge event that has primary exposure to all the top speakers. And we already, like you in the UK, we already have a localized like Saturday events. For example, 2 weeks from now in Hamburg, there's a PowerShell Saturday, which has good coverage. I'm not sure what the best way is, but as far as I can see from the US Summit and our conference, the PSConf EU, it is like there's an ever increasing number of people working with PowerShell, but it is still a very specific target group. So it's not that you could fill stadiums with it.
No, and I think after being at the PSConf EU in 2016, I think the size of that was quite good. There wasn't too many people, there wasn't too few people. The hallway track was always there. There was always a good conversation to be had.
Right.
And as you said, I think on reflection, looking at all of the other conferences that go on. For example, I went to Techorama Belgium last year, and that's 13 parallel tracks.
Wow, yeah.
And that's it's a bit too much going on all at once, I think. I think 3 tracks over 3-4 days is quite good.
Yeah, I agree. And also, most of us have been to like something like a tech ed back when there was a tech ed or other big conferences or Ignite. That is good in its own way, but it is not comparable to, like you say, a conference with 300 people that have really personal contact and great discussions going.
Yeah. So we've covered a couple of the topics. We kind of jumped into the evolution of PowerShell tooling a little bit earlier,
Right.
but I think there's a good one around that we haven't really discussed, and that's the evolution that have come around about how people build and design their modules, because that's kind of really changed over the years. From people having lots of PS1 files being dot-sourced in the PSM1 file to people having build and release pipelines that are actually compiling their PS1 files into a giant PSM1 and shipping that. And I think we've seen a lot of good work around the tooling, but it's all very opinionated. There's not a yes, this is the right way forward, and I think that's good actually. I don't think that there is a definitive right way forward. I think tooling in this area should be opinionated, but I think that causes some confusion with people coming new to the community, because do we use Plaster? Do we use some of the other module framework tooling that we've got, like Module Builder that Joel Bennett's been working on.
Mm-hmm.
There's lots of repeated corners, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you would ask me, I think it is important, like you say, that more and more people discover what modules are and how really easy it is to create a module, to actually do code reuse, and then also make sure you also discover PowerShell Get and the way how you can sort of set up your own repositories as a sort of distribution point for your modules. I personally would not care at all whether people would have a big PSM1 or .source individual script, because like all the testing we did once was, well, it's performance-wise, well, it doesn't matter. And to me, it's much more important that people share those modules, that there is a good exchange, that you can, like, for example, that people have a GitHub where you can manage the source code and work on the source codes, but also release it to the PowerShell gallery so that you can easily just use an install module to grab it.
Yeah. And now we're talking about V5 functionality, because obviously PowerShell Get didn't come in till V5. And you know, just the explosion that V5 has done for module authors with the introduction of classes into PowerShell V5, PowerShell Get, as we mentioned, you know, there's a lot of great functionality that came in V5 that was kind of hidden under the hood, really, because a lot of people were using V5 as this is DSC, but with all the fixes to DSC that were required.
PowerShell 5 was, to me, probably the most important PowerShell release after PowerShell 3, because PowerShell 3, except if you're a DC fan, of course, then it's different. But PowerShell 5 had so many important new things, like the cross-process debugging, or the ability to just type Control-B to break into any script that is taking a long time and you want to figure out what's going on and stuff. Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah, one of the key features in V5 was PS Redline being added in. That changes the PS Redline module by Jason Church.
Right. Definitely, yes.
Whenever I go onto Server 2012 R2 box that's got V4 on it, a little bit of me kind of dies a little bit, because I'm always trying to use the functionality that PS Redline has given me, and I can't, because it's not there, and because V4 doesn't have PowerShell Get, it's not nice and simple for me to just install a module.
Yeah, but you can. There's an MSI, right? You could install it on PowerShell 4.
Yeah. So on Server 2012, Windows 8.1, Windows 7, and Server 2008, you could install the PowerShell Get and package management binaries via an MSI. I actually published a script to the PowerShell gallery that would go and install that. That was part of my my initial build, was to go and pull that down from GitHub. It pulled down the script from GitHub and then ran it, so that I could then continue to install modules on a V4 box, which made it much easier.
Now that you're talking about this, I remember there was a big effort around MVPs a couple of years ago, before PowerShell 5 came out, where the MVPs were really struggling to convince Microsoft that PowerShell 5 should be available down to Windows 7, so that basically you do have the option to have a uniform Windows PowerShell environment, because you can deploy PowerShell 5.1 to basically every machine that is in your enterprise. And that is probably, I was just thinking, if you do install PowerShell Get on PowerShell 4, then you still can't install modules side by side. So if a module is in use, you couldn't update it. So basically,
that was one of the pain points of V4. There was no side by side at all. Right. So it was install once and use once.
But so what would be reasons that you can see why people wouldn't, like, if they are using Windows PowerShell on older servers, why would they stick to older PowerShell versions? Is it because of old Exchange versions running on those boxes?
Potentially. So it wasn't just Exchange. SharePoint was a really bad one for that as well, because of its reliance on stuff in .NET 2 as opposed to .NET 4 for particularly SharePoint 2010 and then 2013. So there were sometimes reasons for why you wouldn't install a later version of PowerShell, or should we say really the the WMF, the Windows Management Framework, onto those machines, which then gave you PowerShell. But most of the time I find that when organizations weren't installing it, it was more of we've got something that we know already currently works and we're not currently really using PowerShell. So why would we then go and install onto those machines a version of the Windows Management Framework that gives us more PowerShell functionality? Some of it, I think, was due to being scared about, just how powerful PowerShell can be because of the fact it's got all of the access to .NET. But that was also a bit unfounded because there was some security features in 5, wasn't there, that came in that we didn't have. So it was like there was so many arguments against that were always kind of batted back with 5 that it always never really to me made sense for people to say, no, we're not going to install 5 on our servers as a default install.
I hear this quite often too, and I sometimes think don't shoot the messenger. So if something is powerful and can be abused, then it sometimes is just a matter of not applying the right permissions or securing things or things like that. And PowerShell is often only showing that things are possible, but it's not really. It's making it okay. It is making it more accessible, but the functionality is already there.
So I am conscious that we're at 5 to 9 UK time, and it's 5 to 10 your time. I do have 2 other small points. So we covered it a little bit, but let's go over what you think. What are your favorite PowerShell features over the years, and let's go version by version. So version 2, because version 1 was PowerShell was there. Was the right
version was definitely modules, because that was the first version that did have modules plus advanced functions. Even though I was hating them at first, I loved the way how attributes could be used to define mandatory parameters and stuff.
For me, modules / remoting.
Yeah, remoting.
It's a very hard call between the two of them. I think I think I agree with you. I think modules win, and with advanced functions as well. But I think remoting in V2,
to be honest, I think remoting was awesome. But to me, only with PowerShell 3, remoting really took off, because with PowerShell 2, there was just not too many PowerShell 2 boxes available, and you couldn't remote into PowerShell 1. And with PowerShell 3, since it was then widely available, remoting really was a default thing.
Yeah,
I think we're on the same page. Remoting is awesome.
Yeah, it's got a bit of an interesting story now with V7. Obviously, because of the move to try and use SSH for the transport as opposed to WinRM, which works fantastically for the newer servers where SSH is installed, so Server 2019. But going back down from a Server 2019 or a Windows 10 machine to a Server 2012 machine, it comes back to that: are we going to install OpenSSH on a 2012 R2 box so that we can use PowerShell remoting over SSH with Windows with PowerShell 7, or do we drop back? And I think this is where most people drop back to using PowerShell 5.1, is because they know they can get remoting working first time every time in 5.1 back down to 2012 R2.
Which is okay. I mean, always take the tool that works for you easiest. And in some respect, PowerShell 7 today is where Windows PowerShell 1 was once. PowerShell 7 is an optional download, just like PowerShell 1. And it is still, the dust hasn't settled yet. So well, give it 1 more or 2 more years, and with the evolution of servers, like you say, then they have everything on board that they need. We'll have a great environment.
I think going through the feature set over the years, for me, V3, the best thing was the better ISE.
Oh yeah, definitely. Although I hated it because I hated it because at that time we just took off with PowerShell Plus with our own editor. We had, I think, 1 or 2 months of revenue, and then ISE 3 came out, and that was it. But it was awesome. In the end, it's always awesome to have great tools. It's just the transition that sometimes is a little bit of a burden.
Yeah, especially if you get used to using a tool and then support for that tool starts declining.
In fact, I think that is still a major issue for many people working in Windows PowerShell. That they for the past couple of years felt a little bit not loved. And I hope that changes now with PowerShell 7 and with the return of OutGridView and WPF and form support and stuff. So I really hope that these split paths now reunite over time.
Yeah, I think the team have got a good vision of where they want to go over the next sort of couple of years. Which this actually does lead on to the next question that I was going to ask, and what do you see in the future of PowerShell? Because for me, I see it being very bright. I see it being something that opens up doors for me to look at, maybe looking at not just being a Windows administrator in some ways, but also looking at administering Linux machines from PowerShell. Yeah, so it opens lots of doors.
If you are sort of a one-takes-it-all person, then of course I wouldn't see PowerShell take over the world. And because there are many other solutions that have been around for longer, and I do see the same bright future that you see, and it is going to be a great and hugely successful tool for what it does best: object-oriented processing. And the widespread use, even in IoT, when you take a look at what people do with it in their Raspberry Pis and stuff. And so I was writing a QR code module once a couple of years ago for the conference, and then suddenly it occurred to me that it is now also working on all the Linux machines. So you get all this reach, you get it for free. And so, I just hope that they add support in Windows out of the box that installs PowerShell 7, so that it's not so hard to really sort of get it.
Yeah, I would like to see PowerShell 7 be added as an optional feature to Windows.
Yeah, too.
That, because I think, as you say, that becomes the easiest way for people to consume it without it being there
you mean
by
like
default.
PowerShell 2 feature, right? The thing that is on by default, which it shouldn't. So you take a look in your control panel, everyone who's listening, and if PowerShell 2 is still enabled, disable it, please.
Yes, please. Especially if you're using any sort of Windows 10 machine, it should be disabled as part of your build cycle process for those machines. I recently tried going with disabling the ISE, which works fine until you want to use OutGridView, and which it breaks, because the bits for showing out the grids in OutGridView actually is dependent on the stuff that is in the ISE, so you can't actually use OutGridView with it. So
but isn't it amazing how used we are? Like, at least how used I have. How do you say this? How much love I have now for OutGridView. I mean, we're all about automation and not having a GUI anymore. And I think when PowerShell 6 didn't have OutGridView anymore, that was an outcry. It is so useful.
The just the amount of different ways that you can make use of OutGridView for, simple things. Like for me, I was using it for piping through from Azure subscriptions to Azure VMs, picking out Azure VMs to then running commands on those VMs. with a 250 VM estate, you don't want to be trying to work out what the machines are, and particularly if they're not in one single subscription, they're mixed across all. Becomes a bit more fun and frantic to be trying to work out which subscription you're working with at one time.
And I was today twittering something about like using PowerShell code to manage the agenda, and I was using a grid view to select tags. And then I got an answer on Twitter from someone from Japan, I think, who is definitely not attending PowerShell Conference Europe. But he said, "Hey, I didn't know that Outgrid View could return values." So many people don't know that it's not a one-way street, that you can use it as a universal dialogue.
Yeah, there's so much around the PowerShell ecosystem that, you know, I think the mass majority that use it, there's no person who's a master of every single thing within the PowerShell language, and I don't think that is something one can aspire to, because there's, you know, take remoting as an area to go down the rabbit hole with. You know, that would be one where you need to know what the transports are, you know, what layer you're using, and how you're communicating between the different operating systems. You know, there's so much more to remoting than meets the eye. Mm-hmm. The same with PowerShell jobs, and then run spaces if you use those as opposed to the jobs infrastructure, or thread jobs from the thread job module.
Incidentally, why Bruce Payette, who actually created all of this, he decided to have a session on exactly that. So in June, he's going to sort of take a look at it from his perspective as one of the original and founding members of the PowerShell team. So I'm really excited to see that, because there's just like, it is in PowerShell since version 1, and we have probably never seen it before, certain features and things. It's amazing. Oh, can I share 2 URLs?
Yes.
One would be PowerShell.beer, like the beer. That is a place where you can grab the pictures. I forgot to post that sufficiently for anyone who attended the conference last year. We had a professional photographer, and he took lots of pictures, and they're still open for grabs, and we're closing down that site pretty soon. So PowerShell.beer, and if you're from the Europe scope, PowerShell.love, LOVE. That would be our place where we are collecting the PowerShell snippets to manage the agenda. Even if you are not interested in the agenda, take a look at the techniques, import Excel, the module from Doug Finke and James O'Neill. It's awesome. You can, in a one-liner, export data to Excel. That's just fantastic. That's, by the way, if you had asked me the question, what is my favorite PowerShell module, I would say import Excel. It is so well done and so efficient, and so it's such a time saver. It actually moves XLSX file format on equal height with CSV, but it's just better.
Yeah, there's a lot going into that module, and a lot of time and effort going into it. I know James O'Neill, who's been doing quite a lot of work on it, as well as Doug, the original author. And for those who don't know James actually wrote quite a lot of the HyperV module, and he's done quite a few talks at PSConf EU and PS Day. So he's certainly somebody that you want to have a look at what he's been presenting about, because he knows his stuff.
Mm-hmm. He's going to be with us this year too, so I'm really looking forward to dive into import Excel now. Now we do the entire delegate management process, not with databases, but we do it with import Excel in an Excel sheet. It's fantastic. It's really great.
And that's what automation's all about, isn't it?
Exactly.
Making use of every single bit of the tool chain that you can,
right,
in a way that's possible. So. As again, I'm conscious of time. We've just gone over the 10 o'clock mark for you, 9 o'clock for myself. We have a final question that is asked on the podcast. What was your first computer?
My first computer? Oh, that was a VC20 Commodore. In fact, it was with 3.5K RAM memory. That was awesome.
That was certainly before my time. I know that much.
So what was your first computer? Let me ask back.
Mine was a Toshiba Portage laptop in 2006.
That was a real computer already.
Yes. Yeah. And that was kitted out with a 192 meg of RAM and Windows XP. And
Wow.
that was it, fully spec'd.
Oh, well, I could tell you stories about how I bought my first 386 from the Hanover Industrial Fair from some Taiwanese people, and they ripped me completely off because they made me pay 8,000 marks. Back then, that was a huge amount of money because I wanted to have a 25 megahertz processor, and then it turned out it was overclocked, and after 2 minutes, always overheated. Well, happy you never really had to suffer these things.
I think we've all suffered in different ways with different bits of tech.
Oh, that's true.
I mean,
yeah.
I definitely suffered the dial-up times. That was fun. So, I think that's everything from us today, because I know you and I can talk for hours and hours and hours, and I'm sure you want to get back to your evening and to bed.
Thank you so much for having me, actually. Thanks so much. That was a great idea.
If there was somebody else from in Europe that you think we should look to try and get on the PowerShell PowerScripting podcast, who would you recommend?
Matois from the Polish user group.
I will reach out and see whether he is willing.
Okay.
Okay, right. Well, thank you, everybody. And I hope this has all been useful for you. If you want to come on the PowerScripting podcast, there will be a link within the video that I will put through shortly where you can put your nomination for yourself for a form. Whether you want to come in on the US show with Hal and John, or whether you want to come in on the EU one with myself, that's up to you. Then there's an option on that. You could decide if you want to do both. We have the US ones are already planned for the next couple of months. We have Mark Krause this month, later on February, I want to say 19th. In 2 weeks' time, February 19th. And then the month after that, we've got Glenn Satari, who's going to be coming on from Australia onto the US talk show. So it'll be like 9 a.m. his time, 9 p.m. US time. So plenty planned out ahead, and we've got plenty of people that are asking to come on. So you'll see more and more of these coming up over the next 12 months. And thank you.
Thank you, Ryan.
For your time today, Tobias. And hopefully, fingers crossed, I've got to have some conversations at the office. I might be at PSCon for you this year.
Oh, that would be awesome. Make sure.
So,
try your best. We will be at Castle Königswerth. We're not going to the zoo, so we're in a castle with a couple of fireplace rooms and stuff. So that's a perfect setting for good talks. Meet you there.
I will, as I say, do my best, and hopefully speak to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
A castle? Oh my gosh. That would be so cool.
PSCon VU is very, very well put together. I only went in 2016, but the evening event in 2016 was amazing. I'm sure it's been amazing every year since. Tobias really knows how to put together a conference.
Yeah, I've never been outside of the US or Canada, so I've never seen anything really old, honestly, because we're such a young country by comparison.
Okay, are we still streaming?
I will end the stream now. Great job.